Zaman is the highest read newspaper in Turkey, and recently it has been seized by the Turkish government. The takeover was motivated by the newspaper's ties to the Hizmet movement of Turkish cleric Fethullah Gulen, which the government accuses of attempting to establish a parallel state in Turkey, and prosecutors accuse Zaman and its affiliates of praising and helping what they called a terrorist organization. Zaman is owned by exiled Muslim cleric Fethullah Gulen, and he is a political enemy of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Early in March of this year, a government-controlled court appointed trustees to take over the newspaper, and the editor-in-chief of the newspaper was fired. The Zaman Media Group's offices were raided late on Friday the 4th of March, breaking through a gate and storming the building before dragging out many of the journalists inside. There was huge nationwide outrage at this blatant violation of human rights, and the following day, approximately 500 civilians gathered outside the editorial offices of Zaman as part of a peaceful protest. As the crowd continued to grow into the thousands, riot police were called to remove the demonstrators, and what was originally a non-violent scene turned violent. Police used tear gas, rubber bullets, and water cannons against protesters and set up barricades to keep people out. Many were injured, and this picture of an injured woman due to the police brutality went viral. By Sunday, the newspaper under new management was already noticeably different, and there was an evident shift in tone regarding the Turkish government. The paper had dropped its criticisms of the government and instead published flattering stories of the president. The front page included a story about Erdogan's planned reception to mark International Women's Day and his visit to the site of a bridge being built across Istanbul's Bosphorus Strait. Rights groups and European officials have criticised the takeover, saying it has infringed on press freedom in Turkey. My focus media item used is the front cover of the Zaman newspaper, which was somehow managed to be published under the old management on Saturday the 5th of March, the day after the decision that the newspaper was to be taken over was announced. The editors of the newspaper expressed one last protest with this confronting front cover. It reads, Anayas Askida, in English meaning, the Constitution has been suspended. The white bold letters produce a powerful contrast against the completely black background, impossible for a reader to ignore the message. The subheading reads, Yesterday marked one of the darkest days in the history of Turkish press. The English version of the newspaper echoed the outrage of the takeover, with the front page reading, Shameful Day for Free Press in Turkey. Gene Sharp is a professor of political science and one of the most prominent theoreticians of nonviolent action. His work has been extremely influential in this theory, and his book, The Politics of Nonviolent Action, is widely considered the most influential work regarding nonviolent action. Conversion involves a change of heart in the opponent to the point where the goals of the protesters are now her or his own. At the other extreme, in coercion, the opponent has had no change of heart or mind, but accepts the demands of the protesters because they feel there is no choice. In the process of accommodation, the opponent resolves to grant the demands of the non-violent actionists without having changed his mind fundamentally about the issues involved. Some other factor has come to be considered more important than the issue at stake in the conflict, and the opponent is therefore willing to yield on the issue rather than to risk or to experience some other condition or a worse result. Saturday, March 4's edition of Zaman and the peaceful protests that followed embody the theory of nonviolence and nonviolent action. I will be exploring these notions further through Kurt Schock's article, Nonviolent Action and Its Misconceptions, Insights for Social Scientists, while simultaneously examining the importance of nonviolence in democratic peace through Ralph Summey's Democracy and Nonviolence. Professor Kurt Schock's article, Nonviolent Action and Its Misconceptions, Insights for Social Scientists, looks in depth at the many aspects of nonviolent action and deconstructs the true meaning behind the term. He notes that up until the late 20th century, scholars have rarely addressed nonviolent action as a strategy for political change in non-democratic contexts. However, more recently this has changed. As the name states, it is an action of nonviolence. That is, it does not involve physical force against human beings. It involves an active process of bringing political, economic, social, emotional, or moral pressure against a powerful body. And in the case of the Zaman protesters and the March 5th edition itself, the opponent that the act of nonviolence was aimed towards was the Turkish government and President Recep Tayyip Erdogan himself. Schock acknowledges in his article that it is certainly not uncommon for the response to nonviolence action to be violence, particularly by a government, and the events in Istanbul are no exception. Schock writes that those who implement nonviolent action do not assume that the state will not react with violence. Violence is to be expected from governments, especially non-democratic ones. He notes, however, that the reaction of violence to a nonviolent act does not mean the act of nonviolence has been a failure, and the message and intent of the nonviolent act can still be communicated to the masses. History shows that often the reaction to an act of nonviolence is in fact violence, particularly in a case where the opponent is in a position of power. Often this reaction of violence indicates that the government or the opponent sees the nonviolence as a serious threat to its power. In the case of the Zaman protests, the police committed physical acts of violence in an effort to suppress the demonstrators. However, the March 5th edition of Zaman, with the headline, "The Constitution has been suspended," is a form of nonviolent action that cannot be suppressed by violence and can communicate a political message nationwide. It embodies political, social, and emotional aspects of nonviolent action and powerfully communicates the outrage and utter disapproval that the journalists of the Zaman newspaper feel, and mirrors the entire country's protest. The takeover of the Zaman newspaper was felt to be the violation of free speech and freedom of press, and these are privileges that we are able to enjoy in a democratic society. The people of Turkey conducted these acts of nonviolence in an attempt to defend their democratic rights, and Professor Ralph Summy further explores the connection between democracy and nonviolence. Summy sees a democratic society being made up of three spheres of political activity: a conventional sphere, a violent sphere, and a nonviolent sphere. He describes the sphere of nonviolent political action to consist of political input by both the individual and a determined group, and there is an emphasis on people power. Summy argues the point that nonviolent political action is very important as it can bring the opponent to the negotiating table rather than to hound him into submission, which is very significant in negotiation and political action. He believes that once dialogue has begun, it becomes possible to resolve the conflict on a win-win basis with the opponent. Acts of nonviolence can be very effective when individuals work together, and Summy states that nonviolence is based on participation, usually widespread participation, and it is difficult for it to be effective without extensive communication and dialogue. The readers of Zaman, and those who participated in these acts of nonviolence, exhibit these traits, as it was communication and association amongst these people, which enabled them to make a difference. Summy refers to Gene Sharp as he states, "No ruler can exercise power without the consent or compliance of a significant section of the ruled. If people, on a scale relevant to the issue at hand, act nonviolently, that is, mobilize their protests, withdraw cooperation, or engage in forms of nonviolent intervention, they are in a position to control the exercise of elite power." While the peaceful protesters in Turkey were unsuccessful in the sense that the government continued the takeover of the newspaper, their use of nonviolent action was successful, as they encouraged many to express their disgust and demonstrated that one should not simply comply with the state, and that each individual has a voice and should not be afraid to speak up. Nonviolence offers the promise of restoring democracy and generating personal empowerment.